Chapter 288 Enchanting Confrontation. Seeing that even the normally extremely steady Elder Hua behaved in such a hurried manner, Qin Yan finally made his decision. Although he could tell Han Li's disdain for this immortal master from his tone, the other person was still a cultivator who was willing to accept disciples. As for whether this immortal master's cultivation layer was high or low, he did not have the time to worry about that too much. Originally he had given thought to have his own juniors apprentice themselves to Han Li. However, in the time he spent in contact with Han Li, he realized that Han Li hadn't the slightest interest in accepting disciples and was unable to pursue this matter. His father had told him that when the first generation of the Qin clan had grown wealthy, Immortal Master Li Huayan made a trip to the Qin clan to see if any of the children had immortal karma. Unfortunately, not a single person had such luck, and Li Huayan could only return with disappointment. During Immortal Master Li's next visit to the Qin clan, the matter of accepting disciples wasn't raised. According to the words of Immortal Master Li Huayan, the Qin clan's immortal karma had only appeared for a single generation and that the Qin clan descendants wouldn't have any destiny of becoming his disciples. But now an opportunity for cultivation had appeared before his eyes. Qin Yan naturally had to give it a try. With this thought, Qin Yan made his decision and called out for his several juniors to go over. Han Li looked at the scene with a cool eye and didn't say anything. Since he already gave Qin Yan a brief explanation, he naturally wouldn't further meddle with their business. With that said, Han Li hadn't paid attention to whether the young masters and young madams of the Qin clan had any spiritual roots. Among the mortals of the secular world, perhaps only 1 in 10,000 had spiritual roots. It was truly a pitifully small few. Just as Han Li thought this, he suddenly saw that of the crowd of Qin clan juniors who went over to Immortal Master Wu, 2 of them unexpectedly turned their head towards him and sneered at him. They appeared proud and satisfied, as if they were mocking him. After Han Li saw this, he blankly stared for an instant before immediately breaking out in silent involuntary laughter. Obviously, when these few people saw that Qin Yan didn't call for Han Li to see if he had immortal karma, they believed that their Lord Grandfather Qin actually truly loved and favored them the most. Thus they appeared extremely content. After Han Li inwardly shook his head, he felt disinclined to pay more attention to them and instead looked around the hall. At this moment, those who remained seated without moving were an extreme few, only 6 or 7. The majority of those who had previously chosen to cut themselves off were displaying complete regret at this moment. The only thing that aroused Han Li's attention was a senior and a youth sitting at the corner of the hall. The elderly person was an azure-robed old man over 60 years old with a head of gray hair. He appeared to be calmly tasting green tea, as if he wasn't paying mind to the matter of immortal karma before him. The youth was smooth-skinned with delicate features. He occasionally looked in Immortal Master Wu's direction with disdain. Although these 2 appeared to be sitting quite leisurely, when Han Li saw the 2, he couldn't help but reveal a slight smile. This old-young duo were unexpectedly both cultivators. Furthermore, their cultivation wasn't bad. The azure-robed old man appeared to have a cultivation base of the 9th layer while the youth cultivated to the 6th layer, not lower than that of Immortal Master Wu. But what slightly shocked Han Li was that he didn't know what technique they used. They were able to almost completely restrain their own spiritual qi. Were it not for Han Li's greatly superior cultivation base, he truly wouldn't have easily been able to make out that they were cultivators. As for that Immortal Master Wu, he naturally didn't have the ability to make out anything strange from the 2. This technique, capable of concealing one's spiritual qi from similarly ranked cultivators, immediately caught Han Li's interest. If he could learn this method, then wouldn't it give him decisive opportunities during battles with similarly ranked cultivators? With this thought, Han Li took a careful look at the 2. As a result, Han Li discovered something strange. The pretty youth was actually a disguised woman with delicate white ears and thin holes on her earlobes. Han Li was slightly stunned. That youth accidentally saw Han Li blankly staring at her and couldn't help but blush, returning a fierce glare back. The movements of the young woman wearing men's clothes aroused the attention of the old man by her side. He wrinkled his brow and turned his head, taking an expressionless glance toward Han Li. When Han Li saw this, he smiled toward the old man. The azure-robed old man felt greatly surprised. He originally believed that it was some clan's frivolous young master that had seen through his granddaughter's disguise and was looking at her with an obscene gaze. But he didn't expect that it was a completely unremarkable youth who was actually looking at her with a completely reckless and fearless manner. The azure-robed old man grew a bit angry in his heart, and after muttering to himself for a moment, he softly closed his eyes. This movement surprised Han Li for a moment, and he couldn't help but immediately guess. He closed his eyes. Could it be he wants to? Having yet to complete his thoughts, the old man's following actions completely confirmed Han Li's guess. He saw the old man open his eyes and look at Han Li with a gaze filled with purple brilliance. He actually used a bewitchment-type technique on Han Li. It seemed he wanted Han Li to make a fool of himself on the spot in order to teach him a small lesson. When Han Li saw this, he found it a bit humorous. An old man at the 9th layer of Qi condensation actually wanted to use a bewitchment technique on a mid-foundation and establishment cultivator such as himself. Was he courting death? By only striking back with a bit of magic power, he would certainly reverse the magic technique onto his opponent. However, since Han Li was interested in obtaining the other party's Qi restraining technique, he naturally didn't want them to feel great animosity towards him. Thus, he could only wear a slight smile on his face and look at the old man without the slightest appearance of anything strange. This caused the azure-robed old man's cold smile to slowly become an expression of shock, immediately exposing an appearance of amazement. The old man inwardly yelled "not good," but when he thought to move his eyes away, it was already too late. The moment Han Li met the old man's gaze, a faint yellow radiance flashed in his eyes. His gaze drew the old man like a magnet, causing the old man to be incapable of moving his eyes away. The azure-robed old man became scared and shocked while simultaneously feeling great regret. He hadn't thought at all that this youth, who didn't appear to have the slightest bit of magic power, was actually a cultivator. Furthermore, his cultivation was vastly greater than his own. Had he known sooner, he wouldn't have used the nightmare technique and allowed his consciousness to fall under the other party's complete control, incapable of breaking free of his grasp. The old man became increasingly fearful, and in an instant, his forehead was covered with beads of sweat the size of soybeans, his face ashen. However, his eyes were still rigidly staring at Han Li. The young woman wearing male clothing at his side eventually saw that her senior wasn't moving. She anxiously pulled on the old man's sleeve with haste. Surprisingly, this tore away at the azure-robed old man's confinement, allowing the old man to easily break away from Han Li's gaze and freeing him from the backlash of the nightmare technique. Right now, the azure-robed old man felt that he had barely escaped from entering the cycle of reincarnation. During this time, his mind had lagged behind, and he couldn't help but blankly stare for a moment. After a moment, he seemed to have woken up, and his consciousness returned to his body. However, the back of his clothes had been thoroughly soaked with cold sweat. At this moment, he hastily said a few words with a soft voice and a terrified expression to the young woman. Afterwards, he didn't dare to look in Han Li's direction again. The azure-robed old man clearly understood that the young woman couldn't have possibly broken his daze so easily, which meant that he must have been treated leniently by the other party. Although he didn't know why the other party had done so, it would be better for this grandparent-grandchild pair to go far away from here. The cultivation base of the youth with a common appearance was truly fearsome. Furthermore, what puzzled him was that although he had used the Heaven's Eye technique to examine him, he couldn't see the slightest fluctuation of magic power on his body. Otherwise, he wouldn't have rashly used the nightmare technique. Could it be this person's cultivation has reached? Once the azure-robed old man made his guess, his face grew green. If it were as he guessed, then hadn't he provoked a major power that should never be provoked? With this thought, the sliver of consciousness that the old man had just recovered became turbulent. Startled, the young woman in male clothing looked at the old man's face as it changed between green and red. She felt great astonishment, seeing this. In her mind, her grandfather, who was always calm and collected with an expression as steady as Mount Tai, was actually dumbfounded. Could it be that the seemingly ordinary youth was truly so fearsome? With this thought, she couldn't help but have the urge turn her head and study Han Li. However, without waiting for her to move her head, the old man seemed to have seen through the young woman's intent and suddenly whispered to her gravely, "Don't provoke that youngster. If my guess isn't wrong, then he's likely to be a Foundation establishment cultivator. You mustn't provoke him no matter what." "What? A Foundation establishment cultivator? Impossible, he's only a youth." The young woman covered her gasp of shock with her jade hands. She turned pale and didn't dare to be too loud.